Bom dia a todos. Como chefe do Instituto Meira Matos, assumindo essa importante função há apenas alguns dias atrás, eu já me coloco diante desse desafio de estar aqui junto dessa plateia tão empolgante, porque eu vejo a convergência de esforços que está acontecendo. Nós estamos realizando um seminário que fala sobre emergência climática, e nada tão oportuno que falar sobre emergência climática uma semana após o término da COP30. Então há uma conversão, uma convergência aí de propósitos, e falar de emergência climática junto à defesa. E junto à defesa, localizando todos os integrantes, nós estamos aqui na Escola de Comando Estado Maior do Exército. É uma escola, não vou citar o propósito dela, leva algum tempo, mas aqui nós estudamos a defesa, a segurança nacional, política, estratégia, uma diversidade de temas e que tem tudo a ver com o momento em que nós vivemos. Eu sei que não vieram aqui para me escutar, apenas uma abertura, mas desde já eu dou os parabéns ao Rubens pela dedicação que esteve à frente disso. Nós tratamos bastante sobre isso e você está muito empolgado, né? E com informações novas, né? Voltou de Belém, então passará diversas informações. Muito obrigado pela presença de todos que estão aqui. Eu cito a senhora Rita Floyd. Muito obrigado pela sua presença, tá? Faço questão de exaltar a sua presença aqui entre nós. Será engrandecedor. E uma percepção minha, vejo aqui um público majoritariamente feminino. Fico muito feliz por isso, embeleza a nossa escola, já que ainda estamos no momento em que majoritariamente os homens estão nas Forças Armadas, mas nós estamos caminhando para a inserção do segmento feminino, mas vocês engrandecem muito o dia a dia da nossa escola, estando aqui compartilhando conosco as informações que vocês já possuem. Tá? Muito obrigado pela atenção. Passo a palavra para a professora Ana Paula, por gentileza. Obrigado.
Bom dia, sou mais baixinha, deixa eu tentar aqui. Bom dia. Bom, eu estou aqui apenas, simplesmente como representante do OIMC, do Observatório Interdisciplinar de Mudanças Climáticas, do qual o professor Rubens faz parte. Eu faço parte do núcleo estratégico. O laboratório, muito rapidamente, é uma idealização e um esforço inicial e atual coordenação e gestão forte do professor Carlos Milani, nosso colega, companheiro, professor e amigo. E eu acho muito assim, importante, nesse momento pós-COP, a gente poder estar aqui presente, né? Vários membros, inclusive do OMC aqui, além do professor Rubens, porque a gente tem visto exatamente, em função do momento atual, da crise climática, e essa tem sido a preocupação também do laboratório, uma necessária perspectiva interdisciplinar para a gente pensar, né, os impactos da emergência climática. A gente já sabe que, enfim, já temos debatido, né, que estamos na era do antropoceno, né, em que o homem é a causa e sofre as principais consequências da emergência climática, né? O planeta vai continuar, a humanidade a gente não sabe. Então, a gente tem que pensar esse tema a partir de diversos aspectos. Algo que, quando se começa a discutir na década de 90, principalmente, né, dentro das universidades, nossos campos de pesquisa, não tínhamos essa perspectiva interdisciplinar, né? Então, as principais descobertas sobre aquecimento do planeta, elas vêm, né, das ciências, vamos dizer, duras, né? E as ciências sociais estão muito atrás ainda para pensar, né, nos diversos impactos da crise climática que enfrentamos. Hoje é mais visível, bem mais próximo do nosso cotidiano, né? e a gente tem pensado essa interseccionalidade, a interdisciplinaridade ao mesmo tempo, né? Então, acho muito importante a gente começar a discutir também no campo da segurança. A gente já tem pensado e tem buscado, né, promover pesquisas e aprender, não é? Porque eu acho que um laboratório no campo da academia serve muito para que os professores envolvidos também aprendam a orientar alunos em novas pesquisas. Então, esse esforço de se pensar as mudanças climáticas dentro do laboratório, a gente já tem feito sobre vários aspectos, e também no campo da segurança energética, segurança alimentar, mas talvez menos do que deveríamos no campo da segurança e defesa, que o Rubens nos traz aqui, e esse evento, né, me é muito feliz aqui estar para aprender. Eu gostaria de poder ficar o evento inteiro, infelizmente não poderei, mas gostaria de parabenizar, agradecer a oportunidade, né, de a gente ter essa parceria aqui, né, do OIMC junto desse evento e, enfim, eu acho que eu já falei demais, gostaria de desejar aqui um excelente evento e dizer que realmente o tema da segurança hoje está para além, né, do que nós, dentro do OMC, temos trabalhado suficientemente. Eu acho que o professor Rubens tem trazido uma contribuição fundamental, mas temos que também expandir isso para mais alunos e orientandos e, enfim, queria desejar um bom evento e agradecer a oportunidade de estar aqui. Isso é uma honra para mim. Muito obrigado, Rubens. Muito obrigado pelo convite. Tá?
Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas e todas. Eu estou acostumado a dar palestra, mas é a primeira vez que eu faço a abertura, então eu peço permissão para vocês para ler as minhas palavras de agora. Então, prezada professora Ana Paula, prezada professora Rita Floyd, prezado Coronel Reis, parabéns pela nova função, é uma alegria receber você por aqui, demais palestrantes. Eu queria começar desejando um bom dia para todas as pessoas que estão presentes. Sejam muito bem-vindos à Escola de Comando do Estado Maior para discutir clima. Clima e defesa, uma combinação de palavras que é muito contestada, muito controversa, principalmente aqui no Brasil. Afinal, as principais causas do aumento da temperatura média do planeta não estão no âmbito da defesa ou da segurança. E, portanto, a superação das mudanças climáticas também não estará nesses campos. Por outro lado, a relação de clima com temas de defesa e segurança é inexorável. Para provar esse ponto, bastaria, por exemplo, dizer que estamos diante de uma ameaça existencial para a humanidade. Mas, na verdade, a gente pode ir além disso. A dificuldade em se achar uma solução para superar as mudanças climáticas nos traz uma verdade que é incontestável. Falar sobre clima significa falar sobre desenvolvimento, significa falar sobre energia, significa falar sobre geopolítica, significa falar sobre, portanto, defesa. As mudanças climáticas são dos maiores jogos de poder do mundo hoje em dia. O PPG-ECEME é um programa de pós-graduação que é civil, mas ele está dentro de uma instituição militar, a ECEME. Então, nada mais apropriado do que, nessa fala de abertura, lembrar que as mudanças climáticas impactam diretamente as Forças Armadas. Por exemplo, os eventos climáticos cada vez mais frequentes alteram o tipo de emprego das Forças Armadas, alteram o terreno das ações, impactam na prontidão e, com certeza, influenciam a doutrina. Também podemos citar que essa disputa em torno da transição energética vai impactar na competitividade das Forças Armadas ao redor do mundo, a capacidade e eficácia dos equipamentos militares, bem como a autonomia dos destacamentos militares e dos seus veículos militares. Hoje, dia 25 de novembro de 2025, várias famílias acordaram em Santa Catarina com suas casas submersas. É, sem dúvidas, mais uma crise humanitária e, claro, mais uma vez as Forças Armadas vão ser convocadas para agir, assim como foram no Rio Grande do Sul, na Serra Fluminense, no Pantanal e na Amazônia. E ainda tem gente que consegue negar a existência e a gravidade das mudanças climáticas. A gente está no quê? No quarto evento isolado desse ano? Por aí? Ignorar o debate sobre clima não é mais uma opção para a defesa. Além dos pontos já citados, temos que ter a ciência de que políticas ambientais irresponsáveis no âmbito doméstico colocam em risco a soberania brasileira. Soberania é essa que deve ser preservada, respeitada e defendida, mas que também deve ser usada com responsabilidade. Uma responsabilidade que não é só nossa. Faz necessária uma leitura histórica das emissões de carbono. Diversas sociedades e países obtiveram vantagens por anos, se aproveitando e difundindo uma economia baseada no modelo fóssil para todo mundo. Essas vantagens se cristalizaram, criando um mundo extremamente assimétrico, ou agravando as assimetrias. É evidente que a solução deve passar também pela responsabilização desses atores. Inspirações de fora são sempre bem-vindas. Não devemos cair no erro de achar que o Brasil é um caso único. Pelo contrário, temos que estar conectados e atentos com bons exemplos que existem para que possamos criar soluções eficazes para o Brasil e, quem sabe, contribuir para soluções de outros países. Por outro lado, também não devemos cometer o erro de aceitar soluções que se dizem universais. As soluções devem partir de nós, devem ser pensadas de acordo com nossas realidades, de acordo com os nossos desafios. E por isso que estamos aqui debatendo. Debate esse que está se consolidando cada vez mais dentro do ECEME. Este, no dia de hoje, é o segundo evento sobre mudanças climáticas nessa instituição. E até onde eu tenho notícia, é o segundo feito na história das escolas militares. Ambos organizados por quem vos fala. Dada a importância desse evento, fizemos um programa que tenta abordar a programação de hoje, fizemos um programa que tenta abordar esses enormes desafios. Cada mesa foi pensada para buscar um aspecto diferente da relação entre clima e defesa. Um evento, é bom destacar, com enorme desigualdade de gênero. Todas as palestrantes são mulheres. Além disso, o momento que fizemos promove um diálogo intergeracional. Todos os debatedores que foram escolhidos são jovens pesquisadores que se destacam em seus respectivos campos. Encaminhando para o final das palavras, afinal, vocês não estão aqui para me ouvir, eu queria falar brevemente para a nossa convidada de honra, a Rita Floyd. Professor, I would like to express my deep gratitude. You took a 12-hour flight, plus a bus. You literally crossed an ocean to be with us. It's very interesting that we've met officially a long time ago when I was in Birmingham for my PhD. But we've just started talking recently. So I'm thrilled that we've met again in IPSA. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity here to hear your ideas. That certainly will add much value to this event. And in name of my institution, I can say that it's an honor to receive one of the most prominent names in academia, not only in security studies, but international relations as a whole. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure. E agora voltando ao português, porque nada mais pedante do que um brasileiro falando inglês para uma plateia de brasileiros. Desculpa, Rita, tá botando, desculpa, pessoal da tradução. Mais alguns agradecimentos. Para começar, meu reconhecimento ao trabalho da Fundação de Amparo à Pesquisa do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, a FAPERJ, sem a qual definitivamente não teríamos esse evento. Gostaria também de agradecer o apoio do Observatório Interdisciplinar das Mudanças Climáticas, OIMC, que hoje está sendo representado pela querida amiga professora Ana Paula Tostes. Aos voluntários que estão aqui hoje, em especial Juvencio e Júlia. Cadê a Júlia? Muito obrigado. E, claro, agradecer ao PPGCM e ao LABMUNDO por terem dado a oportunidade de organizar esse evento. Antes de terminar, gostaria de desejar saudações rubro-negras a todos. Talvez tenhamos um novo campeão brasileiro hoje, mas eu estou falando isso também porque eu quero ver como é que os tradutores vão traduzir saudações rubro-negras. Falei 2 vezes, né, porque a gente investiu bastante nesse serviço e eu espero que, então, né, vale a pena. Muito obrigado a todos. Bom evento.
Bom, gostaria agora de anunciar a professora Rita Floyd, professora titular do Departamento de Ciência Política e Estudos Internacionais da Universidade de Birmingham, no Reino Unido, também coeditora da revista International Affairs. Entre suas publicações se destacam Security and the Environment Securitization Theory in U.S. Environmental Security Policy, The Morality of Security, a Theory of Just Securitization, The Duty to Secure, From Just to Mandatory Securitization, e este ano, Teaching Security Studies. Por favor, recebo a professora Rita Floyd.
Hey. Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much for the introductions and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've had a very good time so far. You know, it's not really that onerous to cross an ocean when you then get shown around and you get to see all the sights, have good food and good company. So it's been a sort of mini holiday. Okay, even though I had to do a talk yesterday, it was actually quite successful. Working on environmental security for 20 years or so. I started my PhD in 2004 and finished in 2007, and that PhD was on environmental security and the military. And I looked at, it was a comparison between what the Clinton administration did and what happened to that program under the Bush administration. And at the time, it was a very niche topic. You know, I struggled to find a supervisor for it, struggled to find somebody who felt competent to actually support this research, because people basically said, well, I've never heard of this. What does it mean? You defend trees by military means? And I said, well, we shall find out what it means. But I very quickly, because I was working on the US, I did some interviews in Washington and became connected to the right people who were very open to have somebody come from the UK and interview them. And so at the time, it was the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. They had an environment and security program. I think they still have it, but it's run by somebody else now. I haven't really looked back since. Obviously, in the interim, the sort of 20-odd years that have passed, the field has grown immensely. You know, we wouldn't have had events like this 20 years ago. So that's a kind of a sign of progress, right? A positive sign for that there are actually more people who are interested in this, more people that are willing to talk about it, signals, you know, it has some legs, this whole idea. So I guess that is a sort of, you know, the positive remark. And so you know a little bit about me. And then obviously in recent years, environmental security has become replaced by climate security. That's what we talk about nowadays. Sometimes environmental security scholars actually are a little bit critical of that, because they think that talk of climate change sidelines other environmental issues, biodiversity loss, for example. But of course, you know, you can make a link between climate change and biodiversity loss. But I think there's just a worry that sometimes climate change or the narrative of climate security could sideline other environmental issues. In recent years, I've come back to this topic in a sort of significant way. I think it's to do with the fact that we are doing a second edition of a book on environmental security, approaches to environmental security, that was originally published in 2013, and now the new version is coming out, I think, at the end of this year. So that kind of forced me to re-engage what has changed in the discipline. And then on the back of that, I've had quite a few articles published on climate security in NATO, for example, but also the perception of the military among climate security scholars, and another piece on the ethics of climate security, which is coming out in Security Studies, I think, next year. So I'm going to draw on all of those things a little bit, but, obviously, if you have any questions about those publications, feel free to ask me. So my talk is called Climate Change and the Military, Awareness and the Future. I want to talk about basically a little bit where are we at this point with climate change in the military and what is a likely future. So, of course, we political scientists, we don't really like to speculate about the future because we might be wrong. But I'm just pointing into the sort of direction that I see, a sort of possible future. But of course, the future is one of our making. We can change things going forward. Okay, so I will very briefly mention what climate change actually is, in case somebody doesn't know. And more specifically, how is climate change actually a security threat? Who is threatened by climate change is what I mean by that. Then the military's impact on the climate. And then the other side, the climate's impact on the military. Then the existing responses. And then from there, the possible future. Okay, so we all know, of course, I guess, what climate change is, right? It is mainly, I think, this global warming of the atmosphere, which is also in part, of course, a natural phenomenon, the greenhouse effect, without which we couldn't actually function on this planet. But of course, the scale that we are seeing is one that is artificially massively enhanced, mainly through the production and use of fossil fuels. What does it lead to? So obviously there's a rise of global surface temperatures. We also know that the oceans are getting warmer. We know that ice sheets are shrinking. When land-based ice sheets are shrinking, there's a problem with sea level rise because it's additional water that is added to the oceans. We know that inland glaciers are declining. Sea levels are rising, I already said, also through warmer oceans. And we know that extreme weather events are increasing both in frequency and that they are getting more extreme. And actually, Rubens and I, we were talking about how we can kind of see climate change now on a daily basis. So in Britain, I would say the weather is confused. The plants are confused. They don't know, is summer over? Is winter coming? And so you see certain things flowering again now in the autumn that should already be dormant, right? I don't know how it is here in Brazil, but I understand from Rubens that there have been various extreme weather events like tornadoes and so on that were not normally part of what you see. So actually, I think we've now moved into this era where you can witness climate change outside of your window, if you pay attention, of course. Does everybody pay attention? No. In Britain, there are plenty of people who think that maybe climate change is quite good. Maybe the weather will be better. Maybe it doesn't rain all the time, and that is a challenge also for people that say, well, actually, no, climate change has more consequential effect than just what you see on a daily basis. It is working. Now, the other point to make is that regardless of how we conceptualize climate change, regardless of whether we frame it as a threat, regardless of how we talk about it, it is an existential threat, as Rubens was saying. And we know that if we look at graphs like this, that the average temperature keeps on increasing. We know that this initial goal of warming of 1.5% degrees rather, degrees, is very likely not to be met, right? That we will be exceeding that, I think. And the trend is one of going upwards. Every year, basically, you hear that climate change, it was the warmest year on record, etc. So it's going into one direction only. Climate change, if we want to think of it as a threat and how to conceptualize it, and some people used to say within security studies, climate change is not a threat or environmental degradation is not a threat because there isn't actually an aggressor. Unless you have an aggressor that intends to do harm, it shouldn't really be conceived as a security threat. But I think we've gone away from that. And now we can say, well, it's not intended by anybody, but it is still caused by people, mainly nowadays through harmful neglect, through the inability or the unwillingness, I should say, to actually act on this issue. It is a threat to a whole range of entities. And of course, you can think of security in different ways. Some people say, and will focus on the entity that is threatened by climate change is all of the biosphere, which is changing. Some people will focus on certain non-human species. You saw earlier the image of the polar bear. The polar bear is kind of I nearly said pin-up symbol of climate change, because it's an animal that I think many people have strong feelings for. Not sure why, because it looks kind of quite cuddly somehow, but obviously it's pretty fierce and ferocious. But it is a keystone species. And so we as the focus to run with that image and to demonstrate the plight of polar bears, because of the shrinking ice, the inability to find enough food, etc., is something that plays a role in captivating audiences. It's a threat to human beings, of course. It's a threat to livelihoods, but it is also a threat to health through, for instance, the northward spread of pathogens, etc., and a whole range of issues, including the extreme temperatures in many parts of the world that we are now seeing, and of course the fallout from extreme weather events. It's a threat to national security, and that takes many different forms. It's a threat to the economy if certain sections are reliant on particular stable weather patterns. For instance, with growing coffee, right? That's a big hit on certain economies that are based on that one singular commodity. But it's also potentially a threat to political security, because we now know, and there was a big debate in the 90s, does environmental degradation contribute to violent conflict? There's a big debate between people who said it does and between people who said it's not actually environmental degradation, so, the shortage of resources that leads to conflict, but it's the abundance of resources that leads to conflict. If a country is oil-rich or it has diamonds or whatever, that's where you see the conflict happening. And then, of course, the scarcity side would say, well, those resources are they're locally abundant, but they are globally scarce. So at the end of the day, it is actually scarcity conflict we're talking about. I think the literature on the link between conflict and climate security has kind of crystallized on the idea that climate change is on its own is not going to lead to conflict in a stable society. But in a country where you already have weak institutions, weak government, and so on, if you put climate change on top of that, it could very well be a trigger in conflict. So that is, I think, where there is now agreement on the link between conflict and the environment. Okay, I'll come back to national security in a minute when I talk about the impact of climate change on the military, but I want to look at the other side first, which is the military's contribution to climate change, which is unsurprisingly not insignificant, right? So if you look at this graph here, comparing the military carbon footprint on a global scale, it says here, is this a pointer? Yeah. If the world's militaries were a country, it would have the fourth highest carbon footprint. It's a very significant figure, right? And it's not something I think we normally think of in those terms. So it comes right after China, the United States, and India. At the moment, there is also a fair bit of work that's been done on actually people trying to chart the climate impact or the carbon impact of the recent wars we've had, in particular the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. So there are people who basically try through usually remote satellite mapping to see what is the scale of destruction, and from that to work out what is the carbon impact of this war. And this is a study here done on the war in Ukraine. But I think it was actually accounted for the first 60 days or so of the war only. But there's also the anticipation of what the rebuilding will be. And you can see here that actually the carbon impact from warfare is substantial, right? And it is an interesting development, I think, that in the UK at least, I don't know so much about other countries, but some of this stuff was featured in the mainstream press. So you'd open a newspaper and somebody would talk about the carbon impact of the war in Gaza, the carbon impact of the war in Ukraine, and basically asking, can we actually afford these wars considering climate change? And that's the first time I've seen this, the first wars I've seen this with. Then another unsurprising figure, the biggest polluters are the most militarized nations. So again, you can see that basically even in peacetime, of course, those countries that develop or that are big on military spending have also a higher carbon footprint. And Germany is in here, which is, of course, at the moment investing hugely into rebuilding its military. But it goes both ways. Climate change also affects the military. This picture here is from Valencia. You all remember those terrible flash floodings there, where the military basically was the only source of support and of cleanup and able to deal with the situation there, helping people, cleaning up the roads, etc. And climate change affects the military in a multitude of ways. These are some pictures from American military bases. One, they're actually in the wrong order. The picture down here is a Hurricane Florence, that led to flooding in the state and affected a military base to this degree. And the other one is the Tyndall Air Force Base, again a hurricane, and you can see the kind of costs that were involved in having to rebuild this. Vast amounts of money, vast amount of damage to the infrastructure that was being done. And when money is involved, of course, certain people wake up to, this is a problem. Maybe we need to do something about this. There are more recent studies that talk about the possibility of climate change being able to undermine the nuclear deterrence capacity of the United States, but also forward deterrence in Europe. And this is also to do with flooding. They've identified a number of bases that are potentially vulnerable to sea level rise. And of course, if you have sea level rise and flooding, you will not be able to maintain the nuclear deterrent on those sites. In Europe, one that's particularly affected is the Incirlik air base in Turkey that houses strategic nuclear weapons, and which was flooded in 2019. Of course, people who have an interest in raising the profile of this will write these articles and will say, look, if we're not careful, even our nuclear deterrence is potentially at stake. So where there is a vested interest as well on the part of the researchers, how can they bring this message across, right? And obviously this is a pretty powerful message to say, look, it's not any odd airbase, but it's our vital deterrence that is potentially at stake here. Then there is the issue of the inability to train and fight in increased temperatures. I think in the UK, or for the UK military, that became an issue in particular in Iraq, first time, because, in Iraq, when the British forces were in Iraq, temperatures exceeded, I think at one point, I'm not sure if this is true, but I think it might have been as much as 50 degrees Celsius. This is correct, right? And of course you have to imagine these poor soldiers dressed in all the kit that they're wearing, and then to fight in those conditions. It's basically impossible. So, you have a lot of people suffering with heat exhaustion, etc., in combat, but also, of course, they can't train in those conditions. So there are many days that are lost to it being too warm. But it also affects military hardware. In particular, apparently, helicopters are compromised in their ability to take off when the air is very hot because of the kind of density of the air, as far as I understand it. So it has real effects on operational capabilities. And then the last one, I think, it is a distraction, right? The military spends vast amounts of time dealing with the fallout from climate change. In some countries, places like the Philippines, for example, that seems to be most of what they do. I understand here this is increasingly becoming an issue as well. Obviously in Spain, the example I already showed you. Here the example I have is from Canada, where you can read for yourself, in 2023, more than 2,000 military personnel were engaged in fighting wildfires for a total period of 131 days. That's a third of the year. That costs a lot of money, huge amounts of money. And the other thing is, of course, if you have your armed forces engaged doing that, they are not available to do something else. And those are real concerns. For people, it's a real concern. This is actually a statistic from NATO. It is a real concern for NATO, which I'll come to in a minute. Now, the outlook here, as the outlook with the increasing temperatures, is that this is not going to change anytime soon. Because if we look at the number of recorded natural disasters, there's just one trend only, right? It's going up. And there isn't really another body of work or institution you can call on to deal with the fallout from natural disasters. In Germany, for instance, they have this Technisches Hilfswerk. They can do parts of it, but they don't have the equipment to deal with sometimes even just mundane things like moving debris, for example, from the aftermath of hurricanes, etc. So, what is the military doing? I wrote a paper on NATO and climate security, so I'm most clued up probably about what NATO is doing as regards, militaries of the world. And I guess the good news is that NATO has taken note of this as part of their strategic concept in 2022. They included climate change. And they even go as far as to say climate change is a defining challenge of our time with a profound impact on allied security, and that NATO should become a leading international organization when it comes to understanding and adapting to the impact of climate change on security. And to do this, they have a range of publications. They do a sort of annual climate change impact assessment. What is the damage that climate change has been done? They also publish a sort of compendium of best practice, where they have examples of the kind of climate adaptations that different NATO bases have done. And they share it within the alliance to show this is what you can do on your military base. You know, this is how we're going greener, this is how we're adapting to climate change, etc. They also have a tool for, I think, measuring the carbon footprint of the military, or they call it a methodology. So they're trying very hard to address this issue. Now, of course, since 22, we've had a change, right? Two changes, in fact. NATO is no longer, or the General Secretary of NATO is no longer Jens Stoltenberg, who was instrumental to pushing this agenda. In fact, you know, he very nearly didn't take the job as NATO Secretary General because he thought the alliance wasn't prepared or willing to engage with the issue of climate change, which he cared about deeply. And only much later, you know, he sort of seized the opportunity through the NATO 2030 initiative to push climate change more onto the agenda of NATO. But of course, you know, the Secretary General can only do so much. There are, it is an alliance of member states and allies, but it's not equal. Everybody knows that. The United States sets that is the dominant voice in NATO. At the time, we had Joe Biden, who was very, you know, accommodating of the climate change agenda, made huge changes, including in the United States. Now we have NATO run by Mark Rutte. He is a former Dutch prime minister, 4 times, I think, but probably elected, not just, you know, there. I think he cares about climate security, but of course there are other issues. The war in Ukraine, for a start, to deal with. But the biggest challenge, I think, is that we have Donald Trump again in the White House. And we know where he stands on these issues. You know, he... And it is a very, I think for NATO, a very fine line, or a very, how shall I say, it's a difficult thing to achieve to keep Donald Trump happy. You know, you have to manage that man. I've listened to Jens Stoltenberg's autobiography, which came out, I think, just last month on Audible, and much of the book is about the management of Trump. It's actually really quite fascinating. And of course, you know, pushing the climate agenda, I think would be very, very difficult with Trump. So maybe they're waiting it out at this point in time. So yeah, in fact, I've already started to talk about it. How can we evaluate the military's efforts in this space, right? So I think that there are certain positives. I think the military has good intentions, right? When I was a young student in 2004 or whenever, and I came to this issue area, I was very critical of the military. Why should the military be involved in this space? Surely they are destroying the environment. When they talk about environmental change and climate change, surely they are only doing that to militarize the climate, etc. You will have heard of those debates, right? But it seems to me that, and we did a study on this, a colleague of mine, Chad Briggs, and myself, actually gauging what is the mood among academics, what is the view of the military among climate and environmental security academics. And the view is generally positive. Basically, everybody now accepts we need the military. It's an important player in this field. You know, there are things only they can do. And actually, I think there is respect for a lot of the leaders among the military that have taken this agenda on board. In Britain, that would be someone like Richard Nugent, whose name I'm probably saying wrong, even though I know him, who has pushed this agenda. And there are people like that in every country, and they are very well respected. I also think, there is generally a much greater understanding among the military that this matters. Like I said, it is on the agenda of NATO. That would have been unthinkable 20 years ago to this degree. Certainly, as part of the strategic concept. But of course, it's not all positive, right? So we look at the other side. We can say not enough is being done for whatever reason. I think one reason certainly is the politics of the day that pushes the agenda onto the back foot. My experience is, and it would be interesting to hear the views here of the military personnel in the room, when I spoke to people in NATO, that work also for the MOD, they feel if they want to do something proactive on climate change, they have to smuggle it in under the veneer of energy security. So basically, the military is susceptible to energy security, but not to the green message. So if you want to get anything across, you have to sell it to them that way. And yeah, this one I've already said, Trump obviously cutting all the funding, calling this a crazy idea. And yeah, I guess we have to sit it out until we get someone else. Okay, now I'm moving to the future. I have no idea how I'm doing for time, by the way, but okay. So the future, the next 5 years. So here I'm putting my reputation on the line by actually saying something about what might or might not happen. So I think that we are on the verge of a new Cold War. And regardless of what we as analysts might say to try and educate practitioners, they are not listening to us. They are as blinded as they were the first time around. They're running sort of completely blinkered into this situation. And I think a lot of security studies people also are quite culpable of furthering this message, right? Why is it relevant? Well, because, of course, any kind of great power conflict is very likely to sideline climate security. Climate security, in my experience, is only ever top of the agenda when there isn't something else more imminent going on. So, I very often I ask my students at the beginning of a teaching year, what do you think is the most important security threat? And what they say depends on what's going on in the world at that moment in time. So, war and terror, sideline climate change. Then climate change could make a little bit of a return. Then it was COVID. Nobody talked about climate change. Climate change a little bit again, but then, war in Ukraine, increasing bad relationships between the global East and the global West, those kinds of things. So I think if we look at history, climate change is sidelined, and I think it's also for a lot of short-sighted politicians on a short election circles a good thing to not having to talk about this problem they don't have a solution for anyway. So they talk about the thing of the day they maybe can deal with, like the war in Ukraine, for example. So one thing that could weirdly kind of change this would be a really bad climate event. I say a climate 9/11. What would that be? I think it would be one of those sort of tipping points being crossed, where you have a significant melting of the permafrost from which there is no return. But of course, we don't want that scenario, because we know that once we've reached that, there's no really any coming back from it, because even if you cut all the carbon emissions, they are already out there in the atmosphere, and they will continue to warm up the planet for years to come. More positively, I do think that there is a sufficient amount of momentum now among members of the international community, call it climate conscious countries, to to push this message of climate change. And if you're thinking in particular about the military, I think that if you put everything together, including the reporting on the carbon emissions from war and how this is actually a problem, I think that there are a sufficient number of people who will push for the inclusion of the carbon footprint into the laws of war. Now, this might seem a bit extreme to you, but if you think about the laws of war, they do change, and they do react in response to what's going on in the world. So, of course, the Geneva Convention already includes long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. It prohibits attacks against the environment by way of reprisals. Some of this, I think was included also after some of the events of the war in Vietnam, where you had environmental warfare. You also had environmental warfare or type of during the Iraq War. And so the International Criminal Court in 1998 also made severe damage to the environment a war crime. So there are certain mechanisms already in existence. So it's not totally unthinkable that down the line it will actually, the environmental or carbon footprint of wars will come into factor into initially the just war theory and later into the laws of war, because it kind of the groundwork is already there. So then, if we move from there to 10 years plus, right? I think that climate change will at least factor into the moral permissibility of war, that people will think, and it comes from this: if climate change is a threat to international security, if it is on that level, if it is a threat on a par with war, then carbon-intense war fighting will increasingly become less of an option for any military. Okay, so that's my prediction. How will it come about? Well, it will come about because of a multitude of things. People pushing this, reporting about the carbon impact of war, scholarly work, and eventually it will make its way into international law. Of course, international law is not very perfect. We know that, how it's acted on. But it's still worthwhile having, because it sets certain standards and certain norms with which we can hold policymakers and institutions accountable. And there are institutions and policymakers who care about that. Thank goodness, still. So yeah, down the line, climate-intense wars will widely be considered unjust. So then the question is, 10 years plus, 15 years, what is the consequence of this? What is the consequence of this for fighting wars, for example? What is the consequence for the number of wars? Will there be fewer? Will this world be more peaceful? For the character of wars? And also, is this all crazy and states end up in a sort of putting themselves in a strategic disadvantage? Well-meaning states, law-abiding states. Okay, so let's look at those issues. I have an ongoing debate with my colleague Patrick Porter, who some of you might know. He's a well-known realist, the only one standing in Britain. As two, maybe. And we have this debate, and he says this is effectively would be a strategic blunder to do this, right? Because in a sense, the morality of war doesn't really matter when push comes to shove. And actually, anybody doing this, right, opting for green warfare, will effectively engage in an act of self-weakening. And who would do this, right? The NATO country will do this, go green, have less capacity, less capability, while those guys up there, well, they're not going to care, are they? They don't care about most other laws of war. Why would they go green? To which I then say, well, that there are some people, it's a balance, isn't it? It's also about how you shape global order going forward. And that some people will care about having a just and legitimate ideal of global order and will therefore adopt this nonetheless. I think that it will matter because the public opinion will push militaries in states into this direction and will say, in the same way as they say now, genocide is illegitimate. What happened in places like Bucha is unjust, immoral, unlawful. They will say climate-intense war is unjust, immoral, and unlawful. And like I said, I think that global leadership, a sort of moral legitimacy, will also be shaped by a country's ability and willingness to reduce the impact of war. Especially, you got to picture this in a world where climate change is much, much more advanced than it is now, where it is more of a problem for everyone. I think there will be a push among the general population to say we cannot have these kinds of carbon-intense wars going forward. Now, will we all be peaceful? No. Of course not. I don't think people are particularly peaceful with each other. They are in Rio here with these two football teams, which still amazes me that they get on well. But in other parts of the world, even, football is an expression of war, I think. Will the number of wars decrease? No. But the prediction is this. I think the character of war will change. I mean, the character of war is already changing. But at the moment, the character of war is pushed by all sorts of things. We already see more drones. But I think that the character of war will also change because of the climate impact of conventional war. So we will have more emphasis on drones, more emphasis on renewable energies, more emphasis in general on USAT-WIM. USAT-WIM are the sort of force short of war. What else can you do to do maximum damage to your opponent without actually fighting a conventional war? And I think we will see a lot in terms of rhetoric when it comes to justifying war efforts. All states do this. The just war theory is hugely abused by all people fighting wars. If you listen to Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, in the war in Gaza, it's all about how proportionate it is, how there is a just cause, how it is self-defense. This is all just war terminology. But I think we will see rhetoric in terms of the climate impact of one's own war vis-a-vis that of the other side and how this will make your war relatively more just than that of the other side. Okay, I'm actually coming to the end well on time, so that's good. What can we say? How can we conclude? So I think that climate change obviously poses a threat to the military, right? But I think it's also an opportunity in a way. We have no choice, right? Climate change is not going to go away. So we got to respond somehow. And I think rather than saying, oh, it's a threat, what can we do? Perhaps, the military ought to kind of seize the moment and see it as an opportunity to develop better and stronger forces equipped for challenges of the future, and to invent new climate-resilient ways of fighting wars. So fighting wars in a green way, which sounds kind of almost a bit perverse because maybe you shouldn't be fighting those wars in the first place, but that's not how the world is. And of course, some wars are just. Okay, I think that brings me to the end. No, this is my last slide. This is the University of Birmingham. In case you've never been there, it is actually very nice. And thank you very much for listening.
Bom, agora eu gostaria de convidar o Pablo. O Pablo é professor adjunto do Departamento de Relações Internacionais e do Programa de Pós-Graduação de Relações Internacionais da UERJ e coordena o Laboratório de Análise de Política Mundial. Por favor, Pablo.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for this kind invitation. Thank you, Rubens, for this great realization. I think this event is quite remarkable for the subject, and as I said to you, and I'm going to say this publicly, you are a cabin-free rocket man. And also, I would like to thank you, Professor Rita Floyd. Yesterday we had a quite interesting debate as well in the plenary of LABMUNDO, the research group that I run with Rubens and other colleagues here. And I'm going to justify the budget of this great event and change to Portuguese. And also because I just can use English to tell bad jokes. And now in Portuguese I can say more seriously about the subject, and I'm going to switch right now. Ok, Rita? Então, bom dia a todas e todos. Bom, uma professora tão brilhante quanto a Rita Floyd surpreende a gente, porque ontem ela trouxe um tema que foi completamente diferente do que ela traz hoje, claro, com várias nuances, mas eu vim preparado para debater basicamente a teoria que ela desenvolveu sobre a securitização justa, que é uma teoria muito intrigante, que de fato promoveu vários debates ontem, né, na nossa plenária lá no LABMUNDO, né, no IESP da UERJ. Mas sabendo que é um tema, enfim, uma outra perspectiva que você traz, e eu acho que a adaptação da sua fala para a instituição em que nós estamos, ela é muito importante, principalmente pela importância de securitização de um tema que deve ser cada vez mais levado como um tema estratégico para os militares em todo o mundo, e eu acho que no caso dos militares no Brasil, mais especialmente. Principalmente por conta da nossa inserção regional muito mais pacífica e sem conflitos, né, o que leva sempre ao questionamento por parte da sociedade sobre o papel dos militares. Então, eu acho que, concordando com o final da sua fala, a securitização da questão climática é uma grande oportunidade para a redefinição do papel dos militares na sociedade brasileira e no Estado brasileiro como um todo. Então, a importância do evento acho que parte muito do entendimento por parte especialmente do Rubens, mas de todos colegas que estão participando, né, de que essa oportunidade ela deve ser entendida estrategicamente, né, uma vez que a gente está lidando com uma ameaça existencial, né, e que essa é a guerra mais importante que nós devemos tratar. Né? Eu estou falando aqui do ponto de vista muito mais pessoal, mas agora eu vou trazer algumas questões que também servem para a gente discutir um pouco essas nuances tão bem colocadas, com gráficos muito marcantes, né? Especialmente quando a gente traz os conflitos que são catalisados por conta das mudanças climáticas, desde questões como a segurança alimentar, fome, seca, enchentes, né, que levam a processos migratórios e luta por recursos que são historicamente conhecidos como os principais fatores que motivam as guerras no mundo. Né? Então, existe uma razão estrutural por conta dessa. Daí talvez eu entenda essa sua previsão de que em 10 anos as guerras não vão diminuir, né? Mas existe também o elemento operacional muito bem destacado, né? Que os custos crescentes e a dificuldade de toda a infraestrutura, a logística militar, a própria dificuldade dos equipamentos que todos os militares têm que usar em circunstâncias extremas, né, de extremos climáticos. Então, existe também essa questão operacional, né? E, por fim, tem o fator, talvez, que seja aí mais importante de todos, que é o fato, né, das mudanças climáticas, né, serem uma ameaça existencial para a humanidade. Né? Então, a gente está lidando com uma dinâmica multidimensional de fatores de conflito que demonstram a centralidade que esse tema deve ser levado em conta a partir do prisma da securitização, né? E aí eu acho que tem, talvez, para estimular um pouco um debate com a professora e com todo o público, tem alguns pontos polêmicos que dizem respeito a uma dimensão ética que permeia todo esse debate, né? Quando que um tema como as mudanças climáticas deve e pode ser securitizado, né? Uma vez que, quando a gente fala de securitização, a gente está falando de um deslocamento da prioridade estratégica da ação dos atores em relação a um objeto específico, né? E a pergunta, ela é uma pergunta que, enfim, que ela, dependendo, né, da sua inserção ética e moral, né, você vai adotar diferentes respostas, né? Afinal de contas, a securitização, ela, existe um debate sobre se existe essa moralidade, porém existe uma dificuldade muito grande em produzir indicadores sobre se a securitização vai, de fato, resultar em soluções interessantes para o problema em questão. Então, a securitização não necessariamente, mesmo que ela seja justa e moral, conforme a teoria da professora, ela não necessariamente ela vai produzir resultados que vão lidar com a escala do problema das mudanças climáticas. Principalmente porque a gente está, quando eu falo da posição ética e moral em que você se insere, é claro que individualmente todos nós vamos pensar com essa responsabilidade, mas a questão é pensar também a inserção dentro do escopo da economia política dos atores que estão diretamente relacionados com o problema das mudanças climáticas. Aí eu estou falando, é claro, dos principais atores que emitem gases de efeito estufa. As grandes corporações, os estados, né, os setores específicos, né, especialmente o setor carbonífero, né, o setor da indústria fóssil, né, a agroindústria, né? Então, a resposta desses atores, ela é fundamental, e o não engajamento desses atores em uma lógica de securitização talvez seja um dos questionamentos mais importantes que eu gostaria de ouvir por parte da professora, como que ela entende essa dificuldade de pensar o problema das mudanças climáticas à luz dessas ambiguidades que os interesses econômicos de certos atores, que são, em grande medida, obstrucionistas, né, como que as mudanças climáticas podem ser pensadas com essa ambiguidade, mesmo se ela for securitizada, mesmo se elas forem securitizadas. Porque, voltando ao ponto inicial, a securitização, ela não necessariamente produz um efeito, né, se não houver o engajamento desses principais atores que emitem os gases de efeito estufa, que são as causas profundas, né, da emergência climática. Então, esse é um questionamento mais amplo, mas que dialoga um pouco com a própria discussão sobre a securitização, porque se a securitização desloca a prioridade do debate para uma lógica de ação emergencial por parte do Estado, né, necessariamente a consequência disso vai ser uma despolitização do tema, né? E a despolitização, nesse caso, pode produzir uma maior responsabilidade por parte dos atores econômicos que eu estou mencionando aqui. Então, o tempo todo, durante a fala da professora, eu fiquei pensando muito nessas nuances da economia política em relação ao tema da securitização das mudanças climáticas. Mas, tentando dialogar aí para fechar essa minha fala e para a gente ter a oportunidade do debate, com as previsões que foram colocadas, existe também um outro aspecto que eu acho que acaba, talvez, corroborando um pouco as previsões, né, de aumento das guerras, mas ao mesmo tempo de uma maior preocupação com o tema das mudanças climáticas, que é a fragmentação do multilateralismo, né, e a dificuldade das grandes potências se responsabilizarem em relação a um tema que é o tema mais urgente da nossa era, né? Então, eu gostaria também de estimular essa reflexão por parte da professora em relação a como que essa fragmentação da ordem internacional liberal, ela dificulta as tentativas, né, de priorização do tema da emergência climática a partir de um escopo securitário, né? Então, acredito que sejam, enfim, questões que surgiram durante a sua fala e que eu gostaria muito de ouvir e também de compartilhar com o público essas reflexões. E para finalizar essa minha breve intervenção, eu acredito, né, retomando o ponto inicial, eu acredito que a importância, né, de tratarmos o tema das mudanças climáticas com esse caráter emergencial, ou seja, como uma definição de uma ameaça existencial para a humanidade, ela não impacta apenas a mentalidade das instituições militares, mas também ela deve ser um aspecto central dos principais agentes, instituições da nossa sociedade. Então, talvez, né, como forma de pensar um pouquinho a corresponsabilidade que existe sobre o tema, né, e de tentar, de alguma maneira, né, produzir cenários menos catastróficos como esses que nós temos hoje, que infelizmente tem se transformado uma rotina, né, de forma que os estudos do futuro têm se transformado cada vez mais nos estudos, né, de previsões absolutamente distópicas, né, que preocupam, que criam toda essa nossa ansiedade climática, né, que eu acredito que seja um problema psicossocial profundamente presente nas discussões acadêmicas e em nossas vidas. E com isso eu finalizo a minha fala e abro o espaço para todas as participações.
Bom, agora estão abertas as perguntas, podem ser tanto em português quanto em inglês.
Bom dia. Vou aproveitar aqui mais um tempinho para falar. Um tema que eu tenho pensado muito recentemente, e aí eu gostaria de perguntar à professora Rita Floyd como tem pensado isso, a relação entre a tecnologia, né, enfim, e militarismo, né, e a importância da tecnologia na defesa, na segurança, e obviamente atravessando esse tema com emissões, né? A gente sabe que a gente está numa era de transição energética com muitos debates sobre a importância da tecnologia, mas aí eu venho, né, de estudos europeus, e os europeus têm a narrativa dos valores, né, de transição digital e verde, né? Mas é algo que a gente ainda compreende pouco, e quando se pensa hoje na importância, né, da inteligência, da defesa, da segurança, em todos os aspectos, tanto no front da guerra quanto no campo da inteligência, a gente sabe que dados são importantes, inteligência artificial, investimento em tecnologia de armas, enfim, em todos os seus aspectos mesmo, né? Mas a gente sabe que esse investimento também pode ser sujo, não é? Também é preciso água, a gente tem o problema dos data centers, a gente tem o problema também das previsões do aumento exponencial, né, de uso de energia e de emissões e de água com o aumento do uso da inteligência artificial e a previsão disso. Estou pensando no futuro aqui, tá? Pensando nas perspectivas futuras. em que nossos jovens mesmo, né, que estão preocupados com o clima mais do que eu estive na minha juventude por falta de consciência e entendimento, são cada vez mais dependentes de inteligência artificial. E isso eu tenho visto muito pouco debate sobre isso. Então, só uma provocação para saber o que a professora tem pensado sobre isso. Obrigada.
Pessoal, vamos limitar, eu acho que tem mais uma pergunta, e pelo adiantado da hora...
Não vai encerrar ainda não, para fazer blocos de 2 perguntas.
Isso, então bloco, mais uma pergunta. Alguém mais gostaria?
Olá, bom dia. Eu me chamo Victor Cabral, sou doutorando em Relações Internacionais pela PUC-Rio. A minha pergunta é para a professora Rita. A senhora falou sobre as possibilidades de conflitos em relação às mudanças climáticas. Eu gostaria que a senhora explicasse um pouco mais para a gente quais são os tipos de conflito que a senhora considera que podem vir a acontecer. A literatura na área de segurança climática ainda não demonstra muitos casos que já tenham ocorrido sobre conflitos relacionados a questões ambientais e climáticas. A gente ainda fica muito no campo da especulação. Há uma vertente que diz que a gente vai ter conflitos mais localizados em pequenas sociedades, outros que é uma possibilidade de conflito internacional. Então, eu queria saber o posicionamento da senhora, como a senhora considera essas possibilidades de conflito e como, por exemplo, o Conselho de Segurança das Nações Unidas poderia responder a essas possibilidades de conflitos relacionados às mudanças climáticas. Obrigado.
I mean, as always in international relations, big questions. What can the UN do, and so on. Let me just very briefly, so before I forget everything I was asked, I want to just briefly respond to a couple of things that Pablo was saying. So essentially the first point he was making was about how, of course, securitization of climate change can also be abused by unsavory actors, right? And I understand from the 2 days I've spent here that there is, I think, in Brazil, a particular concern about the agribusiness. Is that right? That this is a sort of, well, maybe not the best friend of the environmentalists, shall we say? Of course, securitization is open to abuse. When I first started working in this field, when I was an undergraduate student, I actually came to security studies because I had an interest in environmental degradation. And I sort of naively thought, well, if the environment was securitized, treated as the ultimate security, then we would be all right. Things would be good. But then I realized after studying what the US, for instance, were doing about this issue is that they meant something entirely different by environmental security than what I meant. I thought it would be about saving people from environmental harm, and they meant, for instance, at the time, the Department of Defense saving their bases from invasive environmental legislation, that they had to clean up their act, no longer polluting. So, environmental or climate security for them meant to kind of clean up their own act. And you still have that in climate security. So climate security, just the word, requires explanation. Who is meant to be saved, by whom, how. And that's always really, really important when you talk about climate security or securitization of climate change, that you make clear who these points of reference are. Because, 100% will be actors who will try and use this narrative to make themselves look better, to gain from it somehow. But I think then, going back to, the other part of my work I think that just securitization theory can kind of help you a little bit with asking the right questions. Are the actors sincere? Is the thing they're going to do proportionate, etc.? So that, I guess, would be answer to that question. Then on the issue of the breakdown of international order, or international liberal order, I should say, and whether that is sort of necessarily all bad for climate change. There is I think it's probably going to be worse rather than good, but there is one sort of exception. And we were talking earlier about the idea of environmental peace building. That's a big literature as well. So there is a literature, as you were saying, on environmental conflict, but there's also a literature that basically says when there are environmental problems, very often between states in particular, the result is not conflict, but the result is cooperation. It used to be, water scarcity was an issue where people foresaw we would have water wars, etc. But most of the time, when states have shared river basins, etc., they actually cooperate with each other. And there haven't really been any water wars. It's more a sort of word of fiction, really. So on the basis of that, some people think that actually maybe climate change and a threat of climate change is actually bigger than sovereignty and states' borders, and that actually it might potentially be an area where, for instance, the Chinese and the United States can collaborate, work together, come closer together, and potentially build trust, and this spilling over into other areas. So that would be a sort of more positive interpretation of a possible future. And it's certainly, I think, important that the message that we as academics send about climate security and environmental security is not only negative, because I think the negative message is very off-putting for people. It's, oh my God, well, we're all going down the drain, what's the point? But I think actually if you can say, no, there are some things you can do. You can, there's some positive thing you can do in the military or environmental cooperation, even on a small scale, by thinking differently, that does, I think, make a difference. On the issue of AI, I haven't really got an answer to that. I do understand that there is an issue with AI being incredibly resource consumptive, right? And but it's not really something I know too much about. So I'm going to pass on that one if you don't mind. On the issue of environmental or climate conflict. So in the 1990s, the view was, or the fear was, I should say, that environmental degradation would lead to interstate conflict, which is to say wars between countries. It didn't happen, right? In fact, the number of interstate wars has gone down hugely. Most of the wars in the world are civil wars or intra-state wars, wars within countries. And people have tried to explain the reasons for these wars. There's all sorts of theories. Some are ethnic conflicts. So some people say they're come about because of grievance, because of greed, because of primordial hatred. Numerous explanations. You're right. I think that the consensus is that at the moment that we haven't seen a war yet that is purely a climate or an environmental war. But that is not to say that there couldn't be such a thing in future, right? Especially as we have increased water shortages in certain areas. There is a possibility that there would be a lack of cooperation. Another possibility that I see is if space-based geoengineering really takes off. This is the idea that you alter the stratosphere by shooting sulfur particles into space to block out the sunlight, and countries are working on this technology. So that would be a link to the technology question earlier. There's no question that they are working on this, and of course, a lot of people are against it. A lot of academics and public intellectuals, they push for multilateralism, but there is no solution on the table at the moment. Nobody wants to sign any kind of agreement. My view is that we will get an agreement on this when somebody's tried it, so after the event. But I think even then it will become a problem that it could be weaponized. And in order to prevent it from becoming weaponized, you could have a preemptive strike against a geoengineering capability in another state. Maybe not all-out war, but certainly a conflict with war-like kind of symptoms or mechanics to it, right? So that would probably be my answer to your question there.
Ok, eu acho que a gente dá tempo mais 2 perguntas. Quem gostaria?
Tudo bem, obrigada, professora, pela apresentação. Meu nome é Julia Nishio, eu sou doutoranda na Universidade de Hiroshima, no Japão, na área de International Peace and Coexistence. E minha pergunta, na verdade, seria se existem possibilidades de cooperação entre militares, não apenas dentro de um próprio país, mas às vezes cooperação dentro de uma própria organização, propriamente pode ser a NATO, com, às vezes, trocas de informações ou tecnologia. Então, tentar ver de uma perspectiva mais positiva. Essa seria a minha pergunta. Muito obrigada.
Mais alguém? Olha. Você.
Bom dia, professor Floyd. Eu sou doutoranda no IESP. E eu fiquei me perguntando, quando você falou sobre o impacto do clima nas Forças Armadas e, em consequência, as Forças Armadas no clima, eu logo pensei em uma questão de feedback loop nessa área. E fiquei me perguntando se, na sua visão, existe uma tradição dentro das Forças Armadas em que você sempre vai ter esse tipo de resposta, que é um contínuo. E quando você falou da ideia de trazer soluções em respostas no mecanismo de segurança energética para trazer soluções para o clima, se essa seria um tipo de resposta para viabilizar uma quebra dessa tradição. Outra questão que eu fiquei me perguntando foi quando você falou da opinião popular nessas previsões dos próximos anos, dentro das Forças Armadas. E uma coisa que a gente está vendo hoje em dia é o aumento da extrema-direita, em que essa participação popular não é levada em consideração, né? A exemplo do que está acontecendo nos Estados Unidos. Então, se existe na sua previsão essa percepção desse aumento da extrema-direita e de inviabilizar esse impacto da opinião popular.
Okay, thank you for your questions. On the issue of military cooperation, so I think historically there's actually quite a lot of military-to-military cooperation between different countries even, and it was something that was part of the United States or the Department of Defense Environmental Security Initiative back in the 90s. You know, they really fostered this issue of military-to-military cooperation. One of the things that gave impetus for that was a cleanup operation of disused nuclear submarines in the Murmansk area in Russia. They were basically lying there, derelict, seeping into the ground. And so the militaries from different countries came together, and different institutions in the US government as well, as the Department of Energy, Department of State, etc., to clean this up. And it is part of this story of environmental peace building, as it's called, you know, to actually use a joint problem or a joint threat and to turn former enemies into friends, if you like. And it has had, at the time, some successes and was then built to incorporate various other militaries to learn from one another. Certainly within NATO, you see this, right? There are these documents, as I said, on best practice, whereby there are all sorts of examples of what you can do, really trying to educate militaries with part of the alliance and presumably also some of the extended friends of the alliance, what you as an individual base commander can do. And I think the military really ought to be given credit for that, for trying to do that. I don't think it's all just greenwashing, whereby they say, how can we make ourselves look better, in the eyes of the world. I think it's quite genuine, actually, that they are worried about the impact on the armed forces, the impact of the time lost that they spend dealing with environmental disasters, etc. So the time is quite a good time. So then on that question about the continuum, is the answer always the same? I would say no, it isn't always the same, because this issue is definitely more on the agenda now than it ever was. And an event like this is testimony to that already, to be honest, What about the extreme right? It's true that globally, the extreme right, an anti-climate change stance is one of the ways they separate themselves from the rest. I'm not always 100% sure how, certainly in Germany, so I'm originally from Germany, and in Germany I'm not sure how genuinely anti-climate they are, or whether this is just one of the areas where they can position themselves differently to the mainstream, because the mainstream is quite green in Germany. So what I'm trying to say there is it could change down the line, that suddenly the right embraces this agenda for whatever reason. But generally speaking, yes, of course, the right here, the right in the United States is much more anti-environment. Is the right going to stay? I don't know. I hope not. As far as we know, Trump could even put in another 4 years. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But I think that maybe a positive way to look at it is, even though the world on the whole or many countries have this sort of turn towards the right in terms of the local elections, etc., the message of climate change is still getting stronger. So maybe there will come a point where actually even the right can't fully deny the importance of this agenda. So again, maybe a slightly more optimistic tone is the best way forward.
Bom, na verdade, tem uma pergunta que é um pouco a continuidade da que eu fiz anteriormente, que é em que medida a securitização das mudanças climáticas ela poderia ser um caminho para evitar justamente que problemas de ordem estrutural, como a ascensão da extrema-direita, a fragmentação da ordem internacional liberal, as rivalidades geopolíticas, o crescimento de outras formas de guerra, em que medida, então, a securitização é vista por você como uma solução ou, ao menos, um caminho mais efetivo para a humanidade lidar com as mudanças climáticas? Eu sei que é uma pergunta um pouco com uma armadilha, mas eu queria ouvir um pouquinho da sua reflexão a respeito dessa possibilidade de produção de soluções criativas para o fenômeno das mudanças climáticas. Em relação às outras perguntas, infelizmente, eu não posso contribuir porque eu estava ouvindo a professora falar e acho que ela deu conta de tudo.
Not sure I can answer that, but some people say, basically, the point to securitize climate change is now, because if we don't, the issue will not be addressed, and the securitization that we will then inevitably face down the line in a few years' time will be a lot worse than what we have now. that logic is actually will be more drastic, will be more invasive in terms of our behaviors and what we can do, etc. Right? So that's one view. That logic is actually quite similar to the logic that we had in 2006 in the Stern report. I look at you, many here are very, very young. You won't remember the Stern report. It was a report on the economics of climate change. And basically, the message that was made in that report by somebody called Nicholas Stern, an economist, I think, at the LSE at the time, was to say climate change is going to cost us, if we don't address climate change now, in future it's going to cost us all this money. And he had all the figures and everything. And he said, so we should do something now. It's a big investment financially, but if we do it now, it will save us money down the line. So this logic is kind of similar to say, if we securitize now, for instance, prohibit certain kinds of behavior, it sometimes feels a bit, that everybody working on climate change and then traveling from London to Brazil on an aeroplane to talk to you about climate change. There's something kind of perverse about that. Maybe curb kind of travel for leisure, curb the meat and dairy consumption that we have. These are things that governments could do, right? Governments could take steps if they wanted to reduce the carbon footprint of the population. But these measures would be very invasive on our liberties, on our development, on everything that we're used to. We would think in the first instance, it would be terrible. We would be totally unhappy. Maybe, if we couldn't have the same kind of consumerism. But I think at the same time, there's probably also an element of a simpler life that we all are not acquainted with that would maybe actually make us sort of happier if we only experienced it. You were asking about, somebody was asking, she's gone now, the lady, about AI. I sometimes think, if the state curbed the amount of time that children could spend in front of their computers, that would be very good for parents, would be very good for me. I would just say to my children, right, this is a government, not allowing you to be on your screens because you're using too much energy. In a sense, so what I'm saying is, it could be done now, and it would be less damaging than it will be down the line. Have we reached that point? I don't want to commit to kind of recommending we do this. It's also, of course, individual countries would have to do. And then there is an issue of free riding. There is sometimes a sense among the population that Germany is so green at the expense of its own economy. We always have to be the first to do green stuff. And it costs us. It's expensive for consumers. It's expensive. And then you go on holiday somewhere and they don't even recycle. Why do we do all of this? Why do we have to be the leaders? We don't want to be the leaders. And I think if you had a securitization by one country of climate change, what would that do? It would get the leaders that have decided to do this unelected, I'm pretty sure, because one country is not going to make a difference. So then, there are all sorts of problems. It would have to be top down. Do we have the institutions to make this happen? The UN is pretty ineffective. The big institutions are also run by the big powers. The big powers at this point in time are not particularly green. So it's all those things. But I think down the line, as climate change worsens, these ideas of securitizing climate change and actually prohibiting certain types of behavior will become much more acceptable and normal to people. So that's kind of another way of, I guess, a stab at the prediction of the future. Probably didn't answer your question, but yeah.
Tostes. Bom, agora nesse momento, gostaria de chamar aqui também ao palco a professora Ana Paula Tostes para a entrega dos certificados.
Então, se vocês puderem também vir aqui para frente, vocês também vão receber certificados. Professora? Então, para frente ele mesmo. Pablo, para frente. Então, that's fine. Just take pictures and stuff. So, obrigado a todos vocês. Vão receber certificados dos nossos organizadores, nossos alunos. E todo mundo vai receber também um exemplar do Atlas da Justiça Climática na América Latina e no Caribe, que a gente vai ter no finalzinho do evento um soft launch, digamos assim, um lançamento não oficial, né, porque vai estar disponível para venda quem quiser. Também está disponível para download gratuito no Coquetel. Coquetel também é bom, está incluído, tá? Então, por favor, pessoal.
Lá. Era secretário.
E para um livro, pô. Que isso? Ele, o cara não está pensando no livro. Pelo amor de Deus, né? Minha publicação, que isso? So thank you very much. Rita, you stay, because I have a little surprise for you. Actually, yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm full of surprises. So that's not from the institution, okay? That's from me, because otherwise we might be in trouble, okay? But I hate protocol. So I bought you something for you to remember Brazil. So there is a casa here.
Thank you. Very good. Oh, yeah, good.
So this is actually the one we tasted on Sunday.
Hopefully I can take it. Right.
Yeah,
Let's finish it before I get on the...
if you need to finish, just call me. Então, pessoal, a gente vai já para a próxima mesa. A gente vai ter 5 minutinhos só para carregar o PowerPoint e trocar as pilhas dos microfones. Não teremos intervalo coffee break oficial, tá? Mas 5 minutinhos.